Thank you very much for joining us. This is our third and final Stronger Together Virtual Symposium that we've been offering in the months of May and June. This third one is entitled Broadening Our View of Imitation. And I would like to thank Jan, Dmitry, and Brian for organizing this. And I would also like all the participants in this session, I'd just like to thank you for being here and the panelists for being willing to do this. As I said, this is our third. We've had a great turnout with prior events, and we've had, I think, some great discussions. And so I'm very excited that we're able to do this during a period where we can't all get together. So I would like to acknowledge Zhao as someone who has been hosting these and organizing these. So as part of the STR division leadership, I'd like to acknowledge her efforts in all this and thank her for being willing to do this. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to the organizers. I'm going to mute myself. Everyone else has been muted, and they're going to tell you how they're going to control the time. But thank you very much, again, for showing up. I'm looking forward to this session.
So thank you very much, Heather, for the introduction, and Heather, Zhao, and Samina for organizing this series of virtual seminars. It's a great opportunity for us to discuss our work with such an excellent audience. So let me just welcome everybody and thank also all of our presenters and discussants. So Hart Posen from University of Wisconsin-Madison, Tying Yu from Boston College, and Alex Wang from Ohio State, and Marvin Lieberman from UCLA, and Nick Argyres from Washington University in St. Louis. Let me give you an overview of the agenda. After this introduction, we'll begin with a brief talk by Brian Wu about the relevance of imitation in research and more broadly. Then we'll get onto the three paper presentations, starting with Hart Posen. Then myself and Jan Ross will present. And after that, we will have Tying and Alex's presentation. And each of these will be 10 minutes maximum, and there'll be a 2-minute warning before the end of each of those. We'll then move on to the discussants. We'll have Marvin Lieberman giving feedback on each project in particular, so with 5 minutes for each project, and we'll give Marvin a 1-minute warning before the end of each 5-minute spot. And then we will have Nick Argyres giving a broader view on the three projects and on the relevance of imitation more broadly and possible connections with the strategy literature overall. And he will receive a 2-minute warning before the end of that. And then after that, we should have another 20 minutes or so for Q&A. Okay, aiming to finish then at 1:30 Eastern time. But some of us will then be able to stick around and continue the conversation. Okay, so before we get into Brian's presentation, a couple of ground rules. Please mute yourselves unless you are speaking. Okay. Secondly, if you have comments on what you are seeing, please put them in the chat and make it clear which presentation or paper those comments are addressed to, because then we will be able to pick up on them for the Q&A. Okay, I think that's it for the introduction, and over to Brian. Brian?
Hello? Yeah.
You're there? Okay, good.
You can see my slides, right?
We can see your slides. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, feel free to stop me if there is any problem. So thanks, Joe, Heather, and Samina, who is not here, for organizing this wonderful event. And thank you all for coming. It's really nice to stay connected in this difficult time. This means a lot for the community. So I want to start by talking a little bit about why we are doing this symposium. So, you know, when we talk about imitation, we often have two impressions. You know, first, it's not as sexy or heroic as innovation, right? So second, it seems like a bad thing that could hurt social welfare. In other words, you know, innovation and imitation are almost like two siblings. So I have two daughters. So it's like a, you know, a duality, sisters or brothers. innovation being the kind of a, good one, the one who like doing homework, the other one not as much so. So for example, United States considered the innovator, and China the imitator, right? The two brothers or sisters countries. But in this symposium, we want to challenge these impressions, I would say. The idea is that we want to show that imitation is not only a foundational concept in the field of strategy, but also very useful lens for us to see through many difficult strategic decisions, right? So for example, I was reading just this week's cover story of, Economist, right? It's about genius of Amazon. I saw this subtitle, imitation is the sincerest form of capitalism, right? So honestly, I just don't understand what it means, right? It intrigued me. So I'm pretty sure our speakers today will help us better understand this sentence, why imitation is the sincerest form of capitalism, right? Why it's on the cover story of The Economist, right? So, okay, now let me also give you a quiz, right? So the quiz is that which country was a great copyright and patent infringer when it was a developing country? You can shout out or type in the chat box. Or just shout out, unmute yourself, that's okay. All right, love it. Yeah, so actually, if this were my class, you basically got a whole score on this, right? So the US, the story is very funny, actually. So I actually first saw this in a paper by Hard Posen with Marty Gonini. It's a Francis Lowell, this actually Harvard graduate, right? So just like a Marvin Lieberman. He basically went to Great Britain and then stole this, allow me to use a different word, borrowed this technology, right? The loom technology. And then he brought back to Boston, right? And then, of course, in fairness, he just didn't stop there being a pure borrower or imitator, right? So he adapted technology, he improved it, he developed, innovation in the end that's suitable for, New England area, right? So, I mean, that's actually from history.com. So I'm a history buff. So, during lockdown, I've been reading a lot about this kind of stuff. But still, that intrigued me, right? Because if you think about the history of many countries, Korea, Japan, China, a lot of countries, actually the catch-up process typically starts from some kind of a duplicative imitation, and then goes on to creative imitation, somewhere in between, right? And then in the end,
Ryan, 1 minute warning.
Okay, some kind of a innovation, right? So that's the basic idea of this, process, right? Likewise, China, right? So China contact global value chain or the trade war between the two countries, similar, right? So China tried to climb the value chain, and then Trump's strategy is just a breakout. But in fact, if you look at all the game theoretical interactions between the two, right, there are many other possibilities, right? So I won't talk about details, but I only want to say that, in fact, Trump has his own show, right, called Apprentice. In fact, if you think about the apprentice relationship with the master, right, so that's actually, I would say, quite inspiring to think about whether it's actually a way, in terms of imitation, right? It's a way to commercialize your technology, right? When the market for technology is inefficient, right? So the conclusion for me here is that, I have my own thing. Yeah, it's just that it could be a virtuous cycle between the two countries. And a lot of the time, our point here is that, innovation could be, or imitation could be really a brother or sister of innovation. And then together, they can foster a virtuous cycle, right? So that's my introduction. I look forward to our speakers' presentation to help us understand why imitation is the sincerest form of capitalism. All right.
Thank you very much for that, Brian. Good provocative start there. Now, over to Hart.
Okay, well, thank you for having me, and thanks to the organizers for putting this together. I'm going to share my screen now, and if someone could just confirm that it is working. Yes?
Yep, working fine.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so my discussion today is not really from a particular paper. It's really from a series of papers over the last dozen years. And I've come to calling it How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Imitation. Because as Brian noted, imitation is in many ways the poor stepchild that no one wants to talk about and no one wants to admit to doing. So I thought I'd start with a confession. And my confession is that I'm an imitator. Before going back to grad school and disappointing my family by choosing a life of poverty, I was a wealthy, young, very attractive entrepreneur. And one of my ventures was a chain of dollar stores that I started with my brother and my father. In the early 90s, they had been diffusing widely across the US. And in fact, I sent my brother to Minneapolis to investigate what was going on, and he brought back the information, and we literally imitated all of the observable practices, at least as a starting point. And so I've been thinking about, by the way, this became very big. I had 100 locations across Canada, well over 1,000 employees, etc. And ever since then, I've been enamored with this idea of imitation. We don't spend that much time in our field thinking about imitation. In fact, this is my hard work from yesterday, looking at SMJ over the last 22 years and comparing imitation and innovation. 18 papers with the imitation keyword versus 226 on innovation over the same period. 62 papers with imitation in the abstract versus 432 discussing innovation, and 818 papers with the term anywhere versus 1,818 with the term innovation anywhere. And the reason I think this is quite interesting is and this, Brian has alluded to this, the innovation is sexy, imitation is not. Yet, and I have no data to support the following claim, my bet is that imitation as a practice dominates innovation in its frequency of practice. I think it's very important strategically. So then the question is, why don't we spend much time studying imitation as a strategy? And I think the reason is based on what I call a few fallacies. The first fallacy is that imitation is easy compared to innovation that's hard. And in some ways, this is a fallacy that is formed sort of at the dawn of the strategy field and really has its home in sort of IO economics, where firms are seen as the domains of homogeneous, industries are seen as the domain of homogeneous firms, and firms with inferior attributes, knowledge, etc., are seen either to leave the industry or easily imitate and stay in business. And this, I think, is at the core of why we don't pay much attention to imitation. And in fact, it's diffused to work in the more modern strategy field in the RBV, where inimitability is a central focus of the theory. If imitation is relatively easy, firms need to put a lot of effort into deterring imitation. The second fallacy is that imitation is imitation. It's just so easy that there's no need to think about it as a rich set of choices and decisions. You don't need to give it much thought. The only decision is whether to imitate or not. The third fallacy is that only weak firms imitate. Leaders don't imitate. I have no rich data to bring to bear on this, other than a strong belief that this is not true, and I'll make my argument just with a couple of examples. P&G is a big imitator. Many of you probably have a Swiffer somewhere in your home. You know, it folds nicely into a closet, the top folds up, it works very well on hard surfaces. A pure, unadulterated imitation of a product of a Japanese firm. And in fact, its compact size is designed to fit in the small confines of a Japanese home. But not just P&G, Apple is a big imitator. So the first MP3 player was by this little owned Korean company in March of 1998. The first well-diffused player in that business was Diamond with the Rio model in September of 98. Apple comes out in 2001. Just surface attributes. The ring in the iPod is remarkably similar in design and layout to the Diamond Rio. Imitation is everywhere. Leading firms, powerful firms, imitate all the time. You know, the difference is they don't call it imitation, right? They often call it benchmarking. So there's this great story. Xerox, which was one of an early firm to formalize what we now would call benchmarking, in fact, published and distributed a pamphlet in 1987, Competitive Benchmarking, what it is and what it can do for you. That pamphlet is about how to imitate. So what I want to share with you in the next 4 minutes or so, or 4.5 minutes, are a few ideas about imitation that have arisen out of a bundle of work I've done with a bunch of co-authors. A few ideas that come out of that work, but influenced by many others on the panel here today. So let me share with you 4 ideas. Idea number 1 is that imitation is hard and error prone, and that's a good thing, right? And the idea, it goes really back to Altgen, who thought of errors in imitation as a source of inadvertent innovation, right? Attempts to imitate, when imitate is hard, lead to novelty. In a paper with Jae-Ho Lee and Sang-Yoon Yi, we looked at how imperfect imitation engenders superior performance. And of course, when imitation is very imperfect, performance is undermined. When imitation is very perfect, performance is undermined. There is this optimal level of errors in imitation which enhance performance. Idea number 2, there are many different imitation strategies. Imitation is not just imitation. Imitation is multidimensional. Think of the dimensions one has to consider if you want it to be an imitator. Whom should we imitate? What should we imitate? Given we know who we're going to imitate, what practices, what knowledge should we imitate? How much should we imitate? How should we imitate? So in a paper that just came out a few months ago, again with Jae-Ho Lee and Sang-Yoon Yi, we look at this, how should we imitate? And we contrast what we think of as 2 different imitation strategies. Mix and match, which is our term for a benchmarking strategy, where you take the good ideas, the ideas that you think are good from a variety of firms and bundle them all together, versus a simple notion of copying the best. I see the best firm and I attempt to copy them alone. And we look at the performance of these 2 strategies and conditions under which one strategy or the other is superior. Idea number 3, we have this simple notion that laggards learn from leaders. But I think it's important to recognize that leaders also learn from laggards. So, you know, way back in 2009 with Brian and
1 minute, 1 minute.
With Brian and Anne-Marie, we thought about knowledge flows from leaders to laggards, but in fact, there is lots of learning that goes on from from laggards to leaders, right? And the difference is an assumption about the nature of knowledge. Is knowledge vertical? A laggard only knows a subset of what the leader knows, or is knowledge horizontal, right? That the laggard sometimes knows things that the leader does not know. In that case, imitation is bidirectional. Finally, we tend to think of imitation as a driver of homogeneity in an industry, but in fact, there's good reason to believe it's a driver of performance heterogeneity. Brian picked up on my the example I give in my 2018 paper on Francis Cabot Lowell, and did a nice job of explaining it. It is this idea that when you imitate, imitation is also always partial incomplete, and that imitation then is the basis upon which firms engage in subsequent learning and knowledge generation. Imitation can be a form of, can be a driver of performance heterogeneity under some conditions. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for everyone who's attended, and thanks to the organizers for giving me an opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Hart. We are now switching to presentation that I'm giving together with Dmitry. Dmitry is setting up the slides. I had earlier a bit of internet issues. At the moment, it seems stable, so we will start as planned. He has the control. The project is called, or the paper is called, The Roles of Demand and Competitive Uncertainty in Imitation of Resource Allocation Decisions. The project is, I can see the slides now, Dmitry, great, thank you, is co-authored with Dmitry and Yuri Mishina from Imperial also, and Jamal Shemzi from Michigan State University. So you see from the title, and maybe Dmitry, you can go one further, we are looking at the role of uncertainty in this whole imitation discussion. And I listed a lot of papers here in the first bullet point, but uncertainty is actually a common factor across the work in many different areas: sociology, economics, management, in imitation studies. Uncertainty motivates firms to look at industry peers and imitate their investments, was found in empirical research studies. But there are also some studies when uncertainty is common to all competitors. So everybody in the industry faces the same uncertainty. Then under this uncertainty, some are finding that there's actually less imitation. And there are some other studies that even in such dynamic and unpredictable environments, they still observe some form of imitation. Now, if you look at overall into the imitation literature and you follow the AMR piece from Marvin and Marvin Lieberman and Azaba, then there are two broader classifications of imitation. There's the information-based motives of imitation, where it's all about information asymmetries or learning to reduce uncertainty or to imitate because of legitimacy reasons. And then as the second larger area, you have rivalry-based motives of imitation, where it's all about risk mitigation relative to your competitors, as well as an uncertainty that is exogenous to you, meaning identical to all of you. But Lieberman and Azaba, they are actually arguing that various kinds of imitation may actually also coexist, and maybe environmental conditions could help distinguish between those. There's some empirical work out there that actually looks at different types of uncertainty in the same study. Here, Garber and Terlark in 2013, they found that firm uncertainty as well as market uncertainty influences the extent of imitation. But when you look at market uncertainty or uncertainty in the market environment, there could be uncertainty about demand, and there could also be uncertainty about competitor moves. So we are asking the research question, how does demand uncertainty and competitive uncertainty shape imitation behavior? Now, we argue in our moving towards an integrated theory, because we see that the separate debates on different motives of imitation, they actually are relevant to each other. So if we go a step back, then we know that different types of environmental uncertainty contribute to risk in the business environment, and that under uncertainty, social considerations are actually more important and enhanced. And it could be that actually using imitation as a strategy to reduce downside risk could actually help to shape social comparison by external parties. When firms compete as rivals under uncertainty against each other, then relative performance becomes more important over absolute performance. Thompson was saying that many, many years ago. And there might be a desire to actually avoid any potential negative reputational effects from having bet on different paths, uncertain paths than rival. And that might depend a little bit whom you consider as different competitors here. So our overall framework here includes the extent of imitation as a dependent variable. Then we have demand and competitive uncertainty, what I mentioned earlier. And then the competitive focus here, whether a competitor, successful competitor, or how I am standing in the relative performance ranking. So let's start with the first hypothesis here. We are arguing that demand uncertainty that is common to all has a positive effect on imitation, though it reduces the reliance on observational learning. Demand uncertainty actually creates opportunities for rivals for bets of rivals to pay off. In those environments, imitation as a risk mitigation strategies might actually be useful. And if everybody invests in the same area and there are systematic shocks, then you can share the blame. So it's not you who are the idiots, it's the whole industry that was the idiot. Then we argue also that competitive uncertainty has a negative effect on imitation. Unpredictable actions delay competitive response. Swiftly copying unpredictable strategies of competitors can be costly, can put your reputation actually at risk when you're quickly imitating here. They are deviating from the norm, you're chasing after this, and there might be perceptions of lower legitimacy as well as time lags in terms of the performance feedback. Beyond these direct effects, we also have moderator effects of demand uncertainty. When there's high demand uncertainty, the relationship between actions and performance frequently changes. The cost of chasing your imitation target immediately increases. And when the environment keeps changing, it's actually not clear what grants a legitimacy, who grants legitimacy. So there's a follow the leader trap, and the desired signaling effect might not work in those environments where everybody faces the same uncertainty. We then also argue that demand uncertainty positively moderates the positive relationship between performance rank and imitation. That goes back to the work from Dmitry and me on rivalry-based imitation that is more effective under uncertainty. Market leaders, obviously, they are visible to external stakeholders, and they might actually want to avoid the judgment that the current leader isn't fit for the future in uncertain environments. And then finally, market share leaders, they might try to avoid triggering any response that could upset the equilibrium, avoid disrupting routines. And they also get, and we know that from some empirical work, they get actually less punished when not following unconventional moves of others.
Thank you, Jan. So let me then talk about the context that we're looking at these hypotheses in and the empirical approach. So we're looking at the Hollywood movie industry. Specifically, we're using data that Jamal Shamsi has collected that contains information about every film released in the US between 1986 and 2004. And our unit of analysis is a given studio's quarterly product portfolio, where the products are film projects, of investments across 20 different movie genres as classified by IMDb. We think that this is an interesting context in which to look at imitation and uncertainty, because it's one where it's commonly understood that uncertainty plays a big role, as these quotes both from William Goldman, a screenwriter, and Richard Caves, an economist, when discussing the industry, illustrate. Furthermore, it provides a small and stable set of major rival organizations that compete fiercely in terms of box office sales. It provides a context where film investments and box office revenues are observable. There's also a high failure to hit ratio of film projects, which of course comes partly from the uncertainty. And it's understood that there is imitation behavior that happens in the industry. To give you a better idea of the kind of data that we're using, let me give you an example of the investments of a film studio called Paramount in the fourth quarter of 1996. This is the time where they started filming for these 5 different movies. And for each, we know the budgets that they had and the IMDb genres to which these films were classified.
Dmitry, 1 more minute.
Okay, so what we do is we then use this information to create the portfolio of the studio's new investments, okay, by splitting up these budgets among the different genres involved. A dependent variable, the extent of imitation, is defined as the cosine similarity of the focal studio's new investments across 20 genres and a given competitor's previous quarter investments. So we're doing this at the dyadic level, so the extent to which one focal studio imitates each of its potential rivals. In terms of independent variables for demand and competitive uncertainty, we also use the similarity measures for demand uncertainty of opening weekend performance across all genres, and for competitive uncertainty, the portfolio of new investments across all genres. And for competitive performance and performance rank, we're using opening weekend performance figures. As you can see, we are also controlling for a whole bunch of different things which might affect imitation behavior. In terms of some preliminary results, what we have here is that demand uncertainty, which we predicted would be a positive effect on the extent of imitation, only seems to become positive once you consider both competitive uncertainty and its interactions with competitive performance and performance rank. So we are finding some initial support for the hypotheses, but we still have a fair way to go in developing this paper. We've done a couple of post hoc tests around our reasoning and around alternative measures for uncertainty, which are also providing consistent results. In terms of the implications, we think that this project makes the point that it's not enough to consider information and rivalry-based motives of imitation in isolation. That integration of economic reasoning into organizational research on imitation can further our understanding of resource allocation decisions, and that prior work across these disciplines might underestimate the effect of uncertainty on mimetic investment decisions because it does not consider both of these kinds of uncertainty and how they interact with these different motives for imitation. We also think it has some broader implications for the literature, but we'll leave it to the discussion to get further into those. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to both of us for presenting. We are now switching to Alex and Tia Ying's paper. I don't know who will start, but something is happening.
Hi everyone, can you see the screen?
It's white at the moment. Is that supposed to be like that?
Let me see if we resume here. Hi.
Yes, now we see slides. Thank you.
Thank you. And good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone at different places. Thank you for this opportunity to present our paper at the symposium. I'm Alex Wang, an assistant professor at OSU. So the original idea of our paper can be traced back to 2003 when I wrote my qualifying exam paper. But only recently my co-author Tia and I have focused on developing it really. Thanks largely to my co-author's essential contribution and her RA's competent support. So we would like to set the expectation correctly for our audience. The work is in a relatively early stage, but the paper is being assigned as one of the OSU working paper series. We take a slight turn from the imitation topic, and our outcome variable here is reflecting competitive actions by firms. The topic of the paper is a categorization view of interfirm rivalry, and our empirical context is Apple's official app store. So let's start by defining some key terminologies. Building on the recent development of the categorization literature, in this paper, we define categories as shared cognitive frameworks useful for navigating and organizing complex realities by grouping similar entities together to simplify our understanding of what surrounds us. Empirically reflected is the app's product categories. And we define category dynamics as the whole life course of a category from its emergence to diffusion and possibly long periods of widespread usage to ultimately disuse. And our focus in this paper is on the initial phase of creations of new categories. We think in this literature, previous research suggests that new category creations and organizations' category memberships both matter in terms of shaping their behaviors and performance. But most of the previous research has focused on the perspective of audience, such as customers, investors, and stock analysts, when studying the category's disciplining role. What is less understood is how organizations' competitive actions are shaped by category dynamics that I mentioned above. And the pioneer work by Park and his colleagues utilized competitors' perspective and proposed that rivalry can be formed based on attributes such as technologies and geographical locations. But in spite of its merits, their work has two limitations that call for further research. First, though very insightful, Park's work took a very static view of the category system, or what he says is at the category hierarchy. Second, their analysis remained at the stage of rivalry formation, but not really extended to the actual competitive actions. We thus intend to extend the work pioneered by Park. And the literature gap left by Park's early work that is lacking a dynamic analysis, we think can be addressed by integrated insights from the competitive dynamics literature. This literature was influenced heavily by the Austrian School of Economics and hypercompetition, and it has devoted substantial attention to predict intensity of firms' competitive behaviors. And most research has been studied in the established industry settings, such as airlines, automotives, or insurance. And our understanding of how firms compete in new and knowledge-intensive industry settings, such as the mobile app market, remain rather limited. And this neglect is quite unfortunate because motivations and ways to compete tend to be different across industry settings. Moreover, this literature has paid little attention to categorization structure and its impact on inter-firm competition. Therefore, moving beyond this static assumption of the market structure seen in literature such as strategic group, we adopt a more category dynamics view and study the following two questions. First, how do new category creations shape organizations' competitive intensity? And second, how does the competitive tension between the focal firm and rival would strengthen or weaken such impacts? And our first hypothesis is that organizations will compete more intensely in new categories than in established product categories, and for a few reasons. The first one is, while the competitive landscape in established categories tend to be relatively stable, crowded, but organized, but competition in new categories are not established, so that organizations tend to continuously move in search of the next big thing and compete head-to-head with each other. That's where the imitation comes in. Second, learning is particularly important in new categories. For instance, previous research found that competitors are more likely to follow each other's moves for exploration type of drugs in pharmaceutical industry, which reflect our logic in the new market segment. Third, while previous research found that sphere of influence or mutual forbearance can be established in more mature markets, such as the airline, automotives, but organizations in new markets will have more latitude to launch their competitive actions because norms of competition are not yet established, and retaliation is, of course, less of a concern. Consequently, we predict that new category creation will have a positive impact on competitive intensity. We then next unpack how this effect in this hypothesis would be amplified or weakened by factors that may shape the competitive tension felt by the focal firm with its rivals. And our overarching argument is that tension enabling factors will strengthen this effect and tension mitigating factors will weaken it. So given the available time here, I'm just going to cover the tension mitigating factor, identity, ambiguity we identified. Many studies in the category literature have suggested that audiences will devaluate or ignore organizations that cannot be easily categorized, the so-called illegitimacy discount effect. But a small group of study, as cited here, have started to look at the bright side of having an ambiguous identity. We join the latter group, but take a different turn by looking at the perspective of competitors. We argue that ambiguous identity of an organization's products will lead to less tension with its rivals, which is kind of obvious, but here we formally propose the following hypothesis that identity ambiguity will weaken the positive impact of category creation on competitive intensity. First, when the product in an organization is straddling multiple categories, we not only expect that it will confuse the audience, such as the customers, but at the same time, it will also cause difficulties for competitors to form a deep understanding of the company's strategies and tactics. So that's from the perspective aspect. Second one is organizations with products that straddle multiple categories tend to be diluted in terms of their strategic focus and not stretch their limited resources. This is akin to the logic in the diversification literature where scholars found that over-diversification actually can harm firm performance. As a result, rivals would not take such companies' products seriously as threats and therefore would not mobilize resources to fight with such companies. Essentially, we're predicting that ambiguity will weaken the effect of category creation on competitive intensity. The setting of our study is Apple's official app store. According to this company, the store had 1.5 million apps in 2015, and we completed a very liberal data collection effort around the same year, and resulting very proximate population level data equals to 1.44 million unique apps as of 2015. So within this study time range from 2008 to 2015, we identified 3 category creation events at the basic level of the category system. We then identified all the apps in these 3 categories, 3 newly created categories, and the corresponding app developers or other products in other established categories. To narrow our sample further for the research design, we restricted it to apps that were launched before the new category were created. This would result in the sample that we use in a difference analysis where the treated apps are those that were released before the new category creations, but reclassified into the new categories by the platform owner or by the developers. And control apps, 2 minutes? Okay, and control apps would be those that are released by the same set of developers before the new category creations, but in other existing categories rather than the new categories. And we have theoretical foundation in the category creations literature. So the dependent variable we use is product updates at the product level, and our research design is using difference in differences, where for each app we have 6 months before and 6 months after the treatment, which is a category creation event. So in this descriptive graph, you can see that before the treatment, the treated group and the control group show really good parallel trend. And we also formally tested this assumption with a supplementary analysis of differences in differences with multiple time periods, which lend us further confidence that we met the assumption. At the post-treatment period, you can see clearly gap where the treated group increased their product update significantly compared with the relatively stable trend of the control group. So this gives you an initial sense of how our baseline hypothesis is supported. To formally test it, we put in regression analysis with different model specifications, all show the consistent result that category creation has a positive impact on competitive intensity. We further test hypothesis 2, the moderating effect of category spanning, and indeed, we operationalize category spanning as the number of product categories that a focal app product spans. And in this setting, you would span from 1 product category to 2 and to 3. And we also find evidence to support our second hypothesis, which is category spanning weaken the effect of our baseline hypothesis. So to summarize, in this paper, we find 2 major findings besides other ones in the paper version. First one is organizations compete more intensely in newly created categories than in established ones. And second is that category spanning at the product level weakens the positive impact of category creation on competitive actions, because ambiguous identities of these products would mitigate the tension with rivals. We think our paper would contribute to 2 literatures. The first one is categorization literature. First, while previous research mainly take the perspective of the audience, in our paper, we take the perspective of competitors. We think it's equally important, and competitive actions is a literature gap in the category literature, which previous scholars haven't really studied. Second one is that we extend product static analysis to be more dynamic. A third one is we leverage category creation as shocks to the category system, because in this literature, previous category scholars suggested that lack of authority in the setting can be a problem. In that case, you will only need to use informal classification system. But here, Apple, the platform owner, plays the role of this authority and creates new categories and restructure the category system. Finally, we think our
maybe can just summarize that last point, because we have to move on with the time. Just summarize that last point, please. Sorry.
Sounds great. So we also think our paper contributes to competitive dynamics literature in two ways. Is the difference between competitive action in new versus established market. Second one is that in fast-paced and knowledge-intensive industries, previous research hasn't really studied a lot. Thank you very much for your attention. We welcome your comments. Please send us the email. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Wonderful for the presentation. We are now moving into the second part, which is the discussants. We first start with Marvin Lieberman here from UCLA, and he will have 5 minutes for each paper. And I will, when there's 1 minute left for each paper, then I will give you a little signal here so that we have an equal chance for each paper. Go ahead, Marvin.
Okay, Jan, don't worry. Thank you, by the way, for inviting me to be the discussant here. I don't think I'll take 5 minutes. In fact, I didn't actually get papers. I got the presentations. So I think I have less than 5 minutes to say about each, but I will make some general comments about imitation here. So let me start with the general comments. As many of you know, I've written a bit about imitation. This paper on why do firms imitate each other with Shigeru Asaba that was in the Academy of Management Review, and other work on first mover advantages, a topic that I've done a number of papers on, which essentially is about innovation and imitation. So let me just start by saying that, I mean, Hart described imitation as multidimensional. I have it here as a multifaceted phenomenon. This symposium is about broadening, broadening our perspective on imitation, but I would have to say that my view is that imitation is already extremely broad. There are many different kinds of imitation that we have out there, and many different domains in which we see imitation. For example, just in this symposium, Alex and Taiying's paper is really about the timing of investment. The movie paper, Jan and Dmitry and their associates, is really about introduction of new products. I think that Hart is really talking about market entry, sort of much higher level set of issues about imitation. So there are many domains where imitation takes place, and imitations of many different types. I mean, it's really complicated, and some of these are more strategic and others are more tactical. Just to give you some examples, in the market entry domain, which I would call strategic imitation, we all know that to maintain superior profitability, successful innovators need barriers to imitation. Hart said that it was in his slide that most of the SMJ papers published on imitation are actually about the barriers, not about imitation strategies. We've got, I mean, a fair amount of work showing that fast follower strategies like imitation are recommended for most established firms, and I'll give an example in a few minutes that Hart didn't describe of a very successful fast follower. So we've got this sort of imitation at the strategic level, and then we've got this other kind of imitation which tends to be, I think, more tactical, which is in response to environmental uncertainty. Not to say there's no uncertainty up here, but when we've got this uncertainty, I've argued, and Jan and Dmitry both picked up on this, that ultimately, whether you view this from a sociology perspective or an economics perspective, we've got these imitation-based explanations, and we've got rivalry-based explanations, and their paper is designed to try to pick apart these two components in the movie industry. So having said that, let me move on to talk about the papers. And let me start with Dr. Posen's paper here, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Imitation. Give you a minute to appreciate the nice graphic I found on the web. I don't have much to say about Hart's paper because I agree with what he says. I mean, this is, of course, at a very high level. In this symposium, we've got Hart at a very high level. We've got, the other two papers at a much more fine level. Oops. So Hart, points out these fallacies. Imitation is not important. It's not a strategy. All approaches to imitation are the same. imitation is easy, imitation is done by weak firms, not by industry leaders. Industry undermines heterogeneity in an industry. Imitation is not a source of competitive advantage. And I would agree with all of these. You know, and I'll show you one prominent example. On the heterogeneity side, of course, it can undermine heterogeneity, but as Hart has shown in some of his work, it can go in the other direction. So this is a great list of fallacies. Let me just point out that we've got this company called Microsoft, which I don't know if it's number 1 or number 2 in the world in terms of market capitalization at this point. But it continually goes back and forth with this innovative firm called Apple for that top position. And Microsoft has pursued an imitation strategy for decades. I don't know if they would agree to call it an imitation strategy, but that's what it is. Just to give some examples, Word was an imitation of WordPerfect, Excel was an imitation of Lotus 1-2-3, Internet Explorer was an imitation of Netscape, and today Azure is an imitation of Amazon Web Services. So you know, Microsoft has been a supreme imitator and been very successful at it, and I think basically is proof of all of the points that Hart made. So let's cross out all these fallacies. I agree with Hart, and I would argue that his presentation is right on target here. Those of you who have not seen Dr. Strangelove should definitely see it. Okay, let's go on to Alex and Tai-Ying's paper. So it's clear that they have found something interesting, but what exactly is it? So you know, Alex went through this very quickly, but basically when Apple sets up a new category in the App Store, there's a jump in product updates, either significant updates or minor updates. Something happens when this new category is broken out. But what does that mean? Let me just point out some of the context here. I mean, Alex described it in pretty theoretical terms. I'm going to just talk about it in more practical terms. So the App Store has got, I think there are 25 categories, and you see them here. And in their study in this time period, Apple created 3 new categories: medical, catalogs, and food and drink. But then they eliminated catalogs a few years later. They put it back into the shopping category. So what we're seeing here is that when Apple creates a new category, there's a jump in firms refurbishing their apps, essentially. And as an additional measure, they've got what they call category spanning, which is just the number of categories that each app was in. So if a product is in multiple categories, it's going to be a category spanner, and if it's in one category, it's not. So they've got 2 findings. New category creations have positive impacts on competitive intensity, basically product updates. And the second is that category spanning weakens this effect, which they describe as in terms of ambiguous identities. I'm not so sure about that. Let me just make a few specific comments. I view competitive intensity as essentially the rate of incremental innovation. These product updates are incremental innovations, and I suspect that the creation of a new category stimulates customer search and customer demand. And so basically, when there's this new category, customers are looking in that new category, and the app creators say, aha, it's time, you know, if we're going to compete, we should update our app and improve it, so people see that it's, you know, it's new and improved or up to date. There is, by the way, this whole literature in economics, at least, on induced innovation. Jacob Schmuckler found that demand changes were more important in eliciting innovation than changes in the state of knowledge. Actually, pretty fundamental and interesting result. Another point I want to make about the boundary spanning is that I think it's not too surprising that when a product's in multiple categories, it's going to have a weaker effect. I mean, if you're only in one category, you know, that category, any change in it is going to have a big effect on you. But if you're in multiple categories, probably the effect's going to be less. And I would check to make sure that this catalogs category that Apple removed isn't driving those results. So just in general, my comment is these are really interesting results. They're really quite strong, but I think they're more relevant for this categories literature. It's a very interesting literature. You know, Joe Porak wrote this nice paper from a sociology perspective on how these categories get defined. I think this paper can really contribute there, perhaps more so than in the imitation literature. Now let me go on to talk about the movie paper, Jan and Dmitry and Yuri and Jamal. You know, why do Hollywood studios imitate each other? And clearly there's a lot of imitation in Hollywood. And they question, you know, do we have information-based motives here? Do we have rivalry-based motives here? Or do we have both? I think pretty clearly we've got both. So here's this is a question that Shigeru and I raised in our AMR paper. Here's a figure from that paper, and it was when we wrote that paper, I was intrigued with could we really identify this, and I mean, what we conclude from this flow chart is that when you've got an uncertain environment, you've got firms in the same market, they're similar size and resources, distinguishing the motives is hard. You're probably going to have both information-based and rivalry-based imitation. And maybe I'll say a bit more about this later. The paper we published started off, it was just the theoretical introduction to an empirical paper that we've never published. And I think we've never published it because it's so hard to do this, so hard to separate out these different motives. You're always going to have a little bit of each of the motives here in a context like this. So I really admire and respect what the authors are trying to do here, but I think it's an important thing to do, but it's, you know, as to how well we can really resolve these effects and the nature of the interaction, that's a little bit unclear. So let me just say a bit about the paper or the material that I got. It's got really innovative measures, you know, this cosine measure of the extent of imitation, these independent variables, they split two different kinds of uncertainty, demand uncertainty, competitive uncertainty. I've got a little bit of concern about whether there's some, you know, correlation that might be built in these uncertainty measures with the explanatory factors, or with the dependent variable, but I won't raise that because it's still really a work in progress. And they've got all these hypotheses, and they, whoops, and let me just go to their key implications. And I certainly agree that you know, we need to consider, you know, in contexts like this, the information rivalry-based motives together. And there are certainly interesting interactions between them. There are, I think, different contexts where some may be stronger than others. In fact, the paper that Asaba and I still haven't published is really about, you know, different types of product introduction and why you get one type of imitation dominating over the other in these different contexts. But again, let me just say that it's really hard to conclude anything here. So let me just end with some critical comments. You know, as someone who's tried to do this myself, let me just raise some issues. So what exactly is the ultimate objective here? What are we trying to do and for whom? You know, clearly information and rivalry are both relevant, but exactly how do they interact? We've got a set of hypotheses here that are being tested. Can we really cleanly distinguish among those? You know, does this have relevance for managers, or are we just as academics trying to figure this out, which I do think has value. But ultimately, if we can't show some utility, for managers, there's a question of how far we should really push this.
1 minute.
And you know, if we did figure this out, if we had a deeper theory, you know, what could we do with it? So let me just stop there. I don't know if I've taken a little more time than I thought, but I think I'm still within my 15 minutes. Let me just mention it's a really interesting and diverse set of papers. Thanks for having me as discussant, and many thanks to the presenters.
Thank you very much. Great, thank you. So we are now handing over to our second discussant, Nick Argyres. Nick, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Jan.
Great, we can see your slides.
Thank you for inviting me. I think my mission is to talk a bit about the literature in general and where some of these works fit in. I want to start by emphasizing that I have not written about imitation per se. So I'm a newcomer to this literature. I have written a couple papers that touch on the topic, but it was a nice opportunity for me to look at some of the more recent literature and try to organize it a bit and see what I could generate in terms of new research questions. Some of them might be naive, some of them might have been studied already, and I invite people to comment in the discussion part about this. So this quote from Herman Melville, I think really highlights how society feels about imitation in most fields of human endeavor. It's better to fail in originality than to succeed in imitation. I think that's a very stark view about, certainly in the creative industries, how people feel. I think we'd probably disagree about that applying in business. I personally would much prefer to succeed in imitation, like Microsoft. So I think Marvin's wonderful paper with Saba, was titled "Why Do Firms Imitate?" and focuses, as he mentioned, on information-based and rivalry-based motives. There's an older literature about mimetic isomorphism, and so first question for those more knowledgeable is this literature, the latter, seemed to be limited to the 1990s, and at least I couldn't find much about it. And so one question is, why does that literature seem to be superseded by work that takes a more profit-seeking view of imitation? So when do firms imitate? Follows directly from why they imitate. And I think as people have discussed, there are papers about uncertainty leading to imitation, various types of uncertainty, firm-specific versus general. Jan and Dmitry and their colleagues incorporate demand uncertainty and competitive uncertainty. Here's my question, and I think it goes back to something that Hart was saying. How much do we know about the way that technological uncertainty affects imitation? I think the idea is, of course, of many developing countries is that they encourage their firms to imitate technologically advanced rivals with the idea of eventually superseding them. In other words, this is, of course, the point of apprenticeship, that the imitation serves as a stepping stone. Brian cited this paper by Juan Alcácer and Joanne Oxley, which shows that mobile phone companies, at least before cell phones got destroyed by smartphones, they were able to move from being mere imitators and suppliers to moving downstream and doing some more differentiation. So it'd be great to know more about when that can occur and when it doesn't. So for example, there are cases when firms choose not to imitate an advanced rival and just try to leapfrog directly without doing any imitation. So when does one happen? When does the other happen? My impression, as I said, as a newcomer to the literature, is that that question is not well understood. The answer to it is not well understood. Here's another question I think is not well, and Marvin maybe could speak to this. What is the relationship between industry structure and rivalrous conditions and imitation. How does that interplay work out? There is the example of Coke and Pepsi, where Coke and Pepsi imitate each other, and that drives an industry, a very concentrated industry structure. But that doesn't always happen. In other cases, imitation just invites more entry. So it'd be great to know have a better theoretical grasp of the relationship between industry structure, and maybe Marvin's answer would be it's complicated, but this is my question nevertheless. Another issue, and this is something that I've written on myself, is that when firms are making imitation decisions, they presumably have alternatives. As I mentioned before, they could try to leapfrog, or they could try to not imitate and find some other niche to protect their existing technology. And so we'd like to know, what are the costs of imitation relative to other costs, relative to the cost of leapfrogging, or relative to the cost of retreating to a niche, relative to the cost of partial imitation as opposed to full imitation. We know a little bit about that. There's a paper about from Etheridge and Leventhal about modularity, and I've written about comparative adjustment costs, but I think we still need to know a lot more about what are the determinants of imitation costs, and I emphasize relative to other costs that a firm may be incurring by choosing an alternative strategy. How do firms imitate? So we know that there are very different types of innovation. We know that firms can innovate a broader or narrower set of practices from a rival. We know that firms can imitate more creatively, and I think this is a paper of Brian and his co-authors. I think here, this last paper leads me to ask, what are the product and service dimensions that firms choose to imitate around? And often there are multiple dimensions in which a product or service is imitated, and then just one or two where there's differentiation, and that can lead to quite a bit of success. And also, what is the role of imitation in learning about demand? I may want to imitate my rival with the idea that it's maybe a new product category, new industry. We don't know a lot about customer demand, and I want to experiment by adjusting particular dimensions of a product until I settle on, or at least the customer demand becomes clearer. I don't think we know much about that, but again, I might be wrong if I'm missing something. What organizational arrangements facilitate imitation? And what future constraints do such arrangements impose? If I organize my firm primarily to be an imitator, is that going to rule out a lot of innovation? That's kind of brings the March exploration exploitation trade-off into focus. And certainly Microsoft, who has been an extremely successful imitator, has failed miserably in a lot of new innovations. Think about search, or you think about tablets, and I think there's reason to believe that Microsoft fell on the hooks of the exploration exploitation trade-off. But we don't know a lot about that question. And then, of course, there's a question of who is imitated. And Jan and Dmitry have addressed this question, as have others. I don't have any particular questions to add on that. And finally, I can kind of interpret Hart's papers as, this categorization has overlaps, of course, but I interpret it as really, what are the consequences of innovation? Is there performance heterogeneity? How effective is benchmarking? And this, to me, goes back to the question I asked earlier: when does imitation lead to future leadership? And when does imitation simply condemn you to forget forever being an imitator? And what are the performance consequences of either of those outcomes? Okay, I will stop there and turn it back over to Jan.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Nick. Brian, you wanted to show one slide and say one word, and after that, I will hand over to Heather.
Yeah, just a way to motivate our Q&A. So very much, I want to thank Marvin and Nick and all the presenters for their sharing, right? So, I mean, I feel like I understand this sentence a little better, right? So imitation is the sincerest form of capitalism. I think the big strength of strategy field is that we are able to understand the firm level behavior, right? And then I think it can be used to shed light on some kind of macro, economic or country or society level social welfare, especially in the long term, right? So in some sense, it's ironic because imitation is literally the foundation of absorbed capacity, first or second mover advantage, RBV, etc. But somehow, maybe because too foundational, right, kind of taken for granted. So I'm so glad, Jan and Dmitry, they organized this wonderful symposium, and Heather, Joe, and Samina, right, give us this opportunity. So yeah, now I'll just hand back to Jan.
Thank you very much. Heather, you go first, and then we open the Q&A.
Yep, so the only thing I want to do is we have tended to take a screenshot of these at some point during the session so we can post it on our STR, what are we, Twitter, whatever we're doing, so we can post it. If people could turn on their video, and we could just do one quick screenshot, we'd really appreciate it, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. All right, so I'm seeing more faces, excellent. So much better to see a face than a name. All right, so Zhao, are you ready?
Yeah, ready.
So.
1, 2, 3. Say cheers. Okay.
Thank you so much, Zhao.
We got it. Thanks.
Open it up. So I'm going to hand it back to the organizers, and we want to open it up for Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much. So we have now about 15, 16 minutes for the Q&A. That is a lot of time. We will 1:30, we will formally close it, but we will also stay a little longer here in case there are additional questions afterwards coming up. The photo we have done, so the floor is open for any questions. Please raise hand. I also saw some comments here in the chat that I will pick up, but if somebody wants to start with a question, please raise your hand and shoot out the question. I just pick up in the meantime something from the chat. Daniel Kuhn was asking a question, and that is interesting to our paper about the net effect of uncertainty. Daniel, do you want to specify a little more the question here? Is he still here? Okay, maybe.
Hi, Jan. Are you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Sorry, it's just, I think it's a very basic question that, I mean, we know that uncertainty tends to have a paralyzing effect on investment and strategic change in general. So I think I saw in your table where the main effect of demand uncertainty is highly negative, and the interaction term between the interaction term was positive, but much smaller than much smaller than the main effect. So isn't the first order effect is that just everything goes down, including imitation?
Thanks, Daniel. So demand uncertainty actually has a positive effect once you also consider competitive uncertainty and the interactions that we have with competitive performance and the rank of the focal firm, right? So we believe that there is evidence that it's actually positively affecting the likelihood of imitation. It's competitive uncertainty that has a highly negative effect. So the more your competitors seem to be changing their new investment allocations among the different genres, the less you seem likely to follow those kinds of moves, at least according to our results. But I think that the general question that you have is a great one about basically whether or not firms change their portfolios less when uncertainty is higher, right? And I can see certainly reasons why that might be the case in a number of different contexts. In our context, though, I think uncertainties just kind of seem to be quite pervasive. So there is some underlying level of uncertainty assumed to be part of it, and still life goes on. So we guess that it might be less affected compared to other contexts.
Thank you very much. Asim, Carl, you also raised an important point here, linking back whether our paper could be linked back to the multi-market competition here. And while we look at product portfolio, we stayed a little bit away from the multi-market competition literature because I'm not so sure whether competitive retaliation across genres again when movie studios are competing against each other, whether those kind of mechanisms would work here. Something that we would like to look at in future is the switching cost to maybe you are known for a certain genre, Western or something like this, and to imitate a rival here might have switching costs, and they are different depending on the type of genre you want to move in order to copy. So repositioning here has a cost, and I think here we could actually have a look also a little bit in the multi-market competition literature, because moving across markets obviously has also costs, and maybe we can inform a little bit the literature. Asim, does that kind of answer your question, or maybe you would like to add something?
Well, I guess the comment I would have is more, you know, I'm not sure why we should think about this as imitation, right? So all you're showing me is that, you know, these rivals are moving into markets that look more like each other's markets. That doesn't necessarily mean they're imitating each other. It could mean that they are coming up with completely different products in those markets because their rivals don't have, because there's a gap left in that market, or it could be because there's demand growing, right? I mean, so I think the broader point I would make, I think one of the reasons, to go back to Hart's presentation, I think one of the reasons we don't see all that much work on imitation is because it's very hard to actually identify imitation versus rivalry versus, you know, other things changing, right? Or just group effects. And so I would push you to think more carefully about, like Marvin's slide on sort of, you know, here are the three things where these movies really look like they're doing exactly the same thing. I think that comes much closer, but of course it's very hard to get that. But maybe there's kind of, you know, similar stars, similar direct. I mean, something else that is closer to imitation than just the fact that you're in the same markets, right? Because to me, that's just competitive intensity. It's not necessarily imitation. And as I mentioned, you know, my colleague Miles Shaver and my former colleague Richard Wang, you know, I mean, they have a bunch of papers looking at the sort of Chinese TV industry, which have measures quite similar to yours in terms of firms moving closer or further away from each other. And they talk about that as just competitive competition. So I think you want to think about what is imitation and what is competition. But I think it's a fascinating, I mean, frankly, if it was a competition story, it would be fascinating in and of itself, right? So,
all right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that point. And that's yeah, something that we've been thinking about whether we can get finer grained measures of what's going on. But just to clarify one thing, we're not looking specifically at whether they're getting further or closer together to others' portfolios. We're looking at lagged similarity new investments, right? So their portfolios may still remain pretty different, right? It's just, you know, what are your rivals investing in the previous quarter, and are you sort of doing the same allocation across different genres? But point is well taken. Thanks, Asim.
Yeah. So maybe we switch to Alex's paper. And again, Asim, you had a comment here. You were asking who's creating the categories. Maybe Alex, you can directly answer the question. Would you like to?
Yes, I can answer Asim's question. And as shown in Marvin's slide, Apple, the platform owner, created those categories. And we consider it's shocks to the category system. Not necessarily exogenous, but it's shocks to the category system.
And also, right, I think this is a very good question, the intentionality of category spending. Even though, I mean, in the paper, we did not dive into this intentionality issue very clearly. However, we do feel like, right, This is actually a very interesting question. And of course, there are other driving forces of category spending. So for instance, right, if you do not have the necessary resource endowment, that would enable you, right, to spend across multiple categories, probably won't be able to do it. However, right, and maybe you do feel like it can be kind of strategic in the sense that, right, so our study offers a competitive motivation, so to speak, right? So we found that if you are doing actually category spending, that would actually reduce any competitive tension you're going to feel from your competitors. In fact, this is consistent with a small group of research in the categorization literature, which try to understand, right, why firms or organizations, I mean, they try to span or straddle across different categories. Because according to the traditional view, when you are across multiple categories, right, you are going to be penalized. And so the customers, I mean, they would be confused, they're not going to buy your products. And also the security analysts, they are not going to cover your stock. But I mean, these scholars, right, they try to actually understand, given that everybody knows, right, so there is a illegitimacy discount. Why so many firms? I mean, they're still, I mean, doing the category spending. I mean, they found some different driving forces, but I feel like, right, our study, right, based on the very preliminary empirical finding we had, offers additional explanation. So it could be strategic in the sense that, and it may help firms shield, I mean, from very intense competitive tension.
Thank you very much. Heather, you also wrote a question, a clarification question here. I'm unclear about the identity ambiguity and whether it is intentional or a result of other issues. Maybe Alex or Tia-Ying, would you like to respond to that one?
I feel like I already answered that question because,
all right.
And I like that question a lot, so that's why, right, I was thinking about it when Alex was making the presentation. Yeah, so basically what I said just now, right, just, I mean, talk about, yeah, Heather's issue regarding the intentionality.
All right, I was searching for questions here, so I half listening. All right, thank you. Asim, you also had a question to Alex. Why is that?
I think Marvin actually covered this, right? I mean, I think there's just the question of, is this just demand, right? We create a new category, a whole bunch of people flood in, and then we have to, you know, we see more activity in that thing because there's just more, there's more demand in that new category than there is in the old category. So is that competitive intensity or is it just demand? So I think that's something to think about. So.
Yeah. In fact, right, and this is actually a very good, I mean, question. And also, right, Marvin mentioned this as well, I mean, his slides, and he called it demand-induced innovation. And so here, right, I have to actually say a little bit more about the positioning of our paper. We try to kind of locate our paper in competitive dynamics. And Steve, you're right, you can call it innovation, right? I think Marvin is right as well. But in the competitive dynamics literature, we actually view new product introduction, including innovation, as a way of measuring or capturing the competitive aggressiveness of individual firms. So the theoretical background, I mean, here, and actually came from Austrian School of Economics. So basically, right, what we try to argue is when there's a new market, just like what you correctly pointed out, when there's a new demand. So for firms, right, in order to kind of capture this new demand, right, and try to kind of understand and the demand, search for the best model that would actually satisfy customers' changing preference, right? They need to continuously update your products. They need to engage in continuous innovation. So in that literature, they call it entrepreneurship discovery, but they also kind of use it as a way to capture the competitive action of individual firms. So that's why, right? So even though I think you're totally correct, right? So in a new category, there's a new demand that's going to drive new innovation. But that's just our way of, I mean, calling it, right? Because of the positioning of our study. Alex, do you have anything else to add?
Yes, I think Asim raised an excellent question. Thank you so much for the point. And to link to the idea of customer demands, we think in the new category, when it opens, there's a lot of uncertainty. And one source of uncertainty is basically developers don't know what the customer demands are there. So they need to continuously innovate, making this Marvin called incremental innovation by updating their products to meet those new demands. So such competitive moves in identifying, clarifying customers' demands is also part of their competitive actions. So we think the argument can be incorporated into our logic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That links to one of Nick's comments also, where maybe competitive moves or imitation here as a move could be a way of learning more about demand, right? So there's lots of experimentation, for example, going on, and you might want to keep some factors stable, so you are imitating others in the industry, and then you're experimenting on a few other factors in order to figure out what demand is, and that was mentioned as an opportunity actually to study here. I don't know whether anybody else would like to add something here or has general comments or responses.
I have a couple. I have a student, Sang-Yoon Kim, whose dissertation is looking at, and there are others have looked at related topics, the benefits of being imitated. Now, there are many ways to think about these benefits, but one benefit is because of the imitator's uncertainty about what the focal firm is doing, their imitation is often, you can think of it as a slightly different experiment on what the focal firm is doing. And that provides new information to the focal firm being imitated. So it is not just that I imitate to gain benefits, but even being imitated can provide an informational benefit, particularly if there are asymmetries between the imitator and the focal firm in their ability to use the information from what I would think of as this imitator's experiment.
Yeah, I have a thought about that as well. I mean, I would caution against lumping together product updates about learning about demand and just calling that competitive intensity. I think those are two different things. Even a monopolist with no competition may need to learn about demand by making frequent product updates. So, and I don't think that just observing more product updates necessarily tells you about competitive intensity.
Okay, thank you very much. Brian, you would like to say something? I unmute you. You're muted.
You know, it can be measured, right? So, so I see, and my student Gigi, who is at Frankfurt School of Economics and Management now. So we just published a paper at you know, the at organization science. I think in the innovation setting, it's possible to separate out imitation from innovation. For example, based on, let's say, patent citation patterns versus new product introduction, right? Of course, that setting is medical device, right? So medical device, we can precisely capture, you know, a regional, let's say, pacemaker and an imitative pacemaker, right? And then we can also look at the underlying citation patterns, right? Who started whom, leader starting laggard or vice versa, right? So that also interact learning and competition, right? So using a longitudinal data set. So I guess going back to Nick's earlier comment, why isomorphism literature not really kind of active now? I think in part because the inability to separate out, right? Whether it's imitation or it's driven by some underlying demand change or something, right? So maybe, you know, better data. That's why, you know, like some kind of experiments, right? To really tease apart the mechanism, or use, let's say, more fine-grained data that has both innovation and imitation to separate that. So I think very much agree with you.
Okay, thank you very much. So officially the time, the formal part is over, and I wanted to first thank you to the discussants that took the time to prepare, go through our presentations and develop some interesting thought and join us here. I wanted to thank to STR for allowing us to organize this symposium and put a bit more attention on the imitation topic. And I want to thank all the participants who joined us here to discuss and reflect. And I hope that with the forthcoming AOM and all the sessions that maybe we can see some more. I want to invite panelists and discussants to stay a little longer in case there are some more questions, but many of you might also have other obligations to go. So thank you very much. And that was great. And the internet even worked. So I'm very happy too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And yeah, we'll definitely stay on if people want to stay, but officially, you know, it's ended and you're welcome to leave. All right, so Jan, you can be the moderator here.
Maybe we can also say a couple of words for the discussants. So thank you so much, Marvin and Nick, and apologies that we were not able to get you a complete draft of the paper in time. We needed that extra month and a half before AOM to actually get one together. But it's, I think Marvin's comments are very reflective of the state of the paper. It's still very much a work in progress, and we've got plenty to do in terms of focusing the framing and making sure that the empirics are as solid as they can be. But thanks for your reflections on this. And Nick, thanks for the broader overview on your range of fascinating questions on the topic. The only one I will just quickly add to, in terms of the determinants of imitation costs compared to other things, I think, you know, we can go back again to the work on different kinds of isolating mechanisms. Right, so different legal, economic, sometimes even social barriers potentially to imitation. And just as a very blatant plug here, I'm in a lucky position to have recently had a conditionally accepted paper at Academy Management Review, which also positions design as a further isolating mechanism kind. So that should be coming out very soon and should hopefully provide some further room for discussion.
So I wanted to respond to some of, Nick had a lot of interesting and provocative questions. I want to leave the official airtime to the presenters, but let me just make a few comments. So, I mean, why we don't see papers anymore on mimetic isomorphism, to be honest, I'm not sure. I mean, you know, that's the sociology perspective. There is this broader question about whether, as human beings, we are just born to imitate, and whether some of this at the individual level is innate. I mean, but we're talking here about organizations that are imitating. So presumably, the individual proclivity to imitation, whatever it may be, doesn't explain what happens at the organizational level. And I don't know. I've tended to view the mimetic isomorphism as kind of basically pretty much the information explanation, but not all sociologists have liked that classification. So you brought up some interesting points about, you know, technological uncertainty and rivalry in industry structure. So certainly industry structure matters a lot. I mean, at one extreme where you have, when an industry is perfectly competitive, you know, think about farming, like hybrid corn, you know, imitation is diffusion. I mean, there's all this work on technological diffusion, and then when industries become more concentrated, you know, all this strategy and rivalry, you know, it becomes more interesting and more complicated. I mean, just you brought up Coke and Pepsi. This paper that Shigeru and I never published is all about the soft drink industry, and as you indicated, in the U.S., we got this very strong dynamic of Coke and Pepsi imitating each other as a way to, you know, enhance demand and create entry barriers. Whereas in Japan, where there are about 45 different soft drink manufacturers, Coke is the biggest, has about the same share as in the US, but it's a completely different world. I mean, there's all kinds of really interesting stuff going on over there. And you know, when Shigeru stops being dean of a major Japanese business school, maybe he and I will get together and actually get these things out. But yeah, I think that industry structure and the fact that these dynamics can go very different ways, in some cases just based on kind of what would seem to be chance events, is you know, it is an important point. imitation costs versus innovation costs. I mean, Brian brought up the point about absorptive capacity, which is really all about, imitation. I don't know if Hart is still there, but, Hart did his little statistical analysis of the SMJ. If he would have put absorptive capacity in, he would have gotten a lot more counts on imitation papers. And I do think that, Brian brought up, absorptive capacity, the papers are at the firm level, but Brian was really talking about this at the country level. I mean, China's had a strategy of absorptive capacity, of various types of practices. The Japanese did some of the same things, decades ago. And then the question is, once you get to this level, how does it emerge? Do you actually get more innovation? I do think that there's an interesting, difference between established firms and startups. That for established firms, being an imitator like Microsoft is usually the dominant strategy. You got the resources to do it. You invest in absorptive capacity or whatever. And if you're a startup, you just, you roll the dice and take your chances with an innovation. There's no way you're going to beat Microsoft, of course.
Yeah, just
anyway.
a quick addition. I think Dan and Wes, when they wrote the absorptive capacity paper, I think the contact was the Japanese firms imitating US firm. That's the late 80s, I think. That was a big debate at that time. So that motivated them to write this absorptive capacity, right? And then, the opening paragraph, exactly as you described. Yeah.
Right.
Can I just add something on, because I just had a chat comment from Dmitry and to Jan's paper on the imitation in the movie industry, because for me, I think it's also quite important to look at what type of good we have, because movies are experience goods. In other words, you have to see the movie as a customer to actually, know whether you liked it. And so we do have an issue there with sort of signaling. And then the other thing about this product is that these movies are tremendously expensive. So we cannot sort of invest in the sort of, in incremental terms. So this sort of copying strategy has been sort of super common because only about 10% of the movies are actually, do break even. And so copying something that is successful, and even copying yourself in the sense of, sequels have been sort of a super, essentially a type of self-imitation. I think the intriguing thing there is because you looked at data from the 1990s, and I think it was a very different industry then. Now, of course, with Netflix having all this data on how customers actually, use, or actually, what their patterns of watching things and what they find attractive, I think it could be quite intriguing to actually compare, the time you looked at and sort of the modern times, and then see really what is what is imitation and what might be just inherent in the industry itself. But I think it's a cool starting point there. Hope I made it a bit more clear on what I thought.
Yeah. Can I just add for you guys, add to those comments, something that didn't make it into my slide is that, you're assuming that all firms are the same, all these movie companies are the same, but they're not. Some, Disney, is very different from a smaller, I don't know exactly how many studios are in your sample, but there are reasons why the pattern of imitation would vary from firm to firm based on things that you might be able to capture in your analysis.
Yeah,
it's a great, because there's so much data. It's a great context to look at these things. It's just, it's just hard to make sense of it all.
Yeah, and there's a lot on leaders and laggards and different resources. And in the international business literature, the idea of catching up versus seeking diversity versus exploiting what you have in a different market. All of that I think is very relevant to some of these strategy choices that are kind of under considered as well.
Would it be fair to say about this literature about imitation that We have some interesting conceptual papers, theoretical papers, papers that use modeling of various kinds, but that when we come to the empirical context, we struggle because it's difficult to really define and measure imitation precisely relative to other things, and that lots of things get conflated. Would that be a summary of?
I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I agree. It's like an industry life cycle, right? This academic field, academic industry, right? So kind of phenomena and theorizing, but then the measurement not really catching up. So in fact, when Anne-Marie, Hart, and I wrote our paper, so honestly, the 2009 paper, asymmetric spillover. So I always debated with Anne-Marie, or even fought with her, because I was saying, look, we can't measure spillover. But Anne-Marie, obviously very strong-minded. She's like, fine. So we look at the patterns. So later I was like, okay, at least we should try to, for example, in certain settings, I think you guys mentioned, right? Maybe in certain settings, we can, for example, medical device, FDA actually classifies certain products as imitative, right? They call it 510K, for which you don't need to go through the lengthy approval process. And then they also have a patent data can match to the product, right? So that can get closer. So another way is some kind of experiment. So in the context of Chinese firms, right? They call it a copycat or Shenzhen, or not iPhone, but iPhone. so what we did was we put them together and then in front of our customers. Turns out that some of them indeed hurt iPhone sales, but some of them actually benefit the iPhone sales, either because of this kind of advertising effect, or what we show is psychologically the rising middle class, the young people, feel even better when they see a lousy Shenzhen or copycat on the side. They're like, my iPhone is awesome, right? So they're actually more willing to pay for iPhone. So yeah, to come back to your comment, indeed, if we think about the life cycle of this literature, probably I think more empirics, right? In certain settings, or IB literature, as Heather said, right? Then probably that's the stage it should be, to revive previous theoretical discussions.
Yeah, no, it also suggests that your comment suggests that demand uncertainty is very complicated, right? And so we simplify it, but it's younger, older, like demographic, everything that has effect. All right, so I am going to end this session because I think it's down to mostly the people who are part of the session. And so that's a good sign to say, let's end it here. But thank you so much. We really have appreciated STR. We've been trying to do stuff for our members, and we've really appreciated people stepping up and being part of this. And so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, all right.
Thank you.
You guys will get the chat later. Someone will copy it for you and paste it and send it to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. I'm going to end this. Thank you.